For the first time, it actually seems like if you were lucky enough, that is, to invest in property, that you may be a little bit worried that it's not as safe as houses, that it could go backwards, that you could buy the wrong investment, that it may never make you any money, and if it does, it will take a very, very long time. So what's going to happen this year? This time of the year, we always ask for predictions. We ask for that crystal ball to come out and to ask experts in various areas. What's going to happen? Where should I take all my hard-earned cash? Well, Phil Manning is the property advisor from WBP Property Group. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Richelle. How are you?
Very well, thank you. A little cooler now.
That's lovely, isn't it?
Slept a little bit.
Yes, it's great.
You don't realise how much the heat affects you until you live through it.
And it's really hard to get a decent night's sleep and feel refreshed.
I discovered yesterday in the middle of the day that I'd run out of bread, and with the 5-month-old I was like, I can't leave the house to even buy bread. I'm going to have to bake my own bread. But, you survive.
Nothing wrong with that.
First world problem, really, isn't it?
That's right.
I'm sure we'd get through. Look, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Now, property is such an interesting area generally, but given the landscape over the last couple of years, we've seen interest rates drop dramatically. We've seen house prices and the flat prices rise dramatically. I mean, I never thought that I'd see in my lifetime, let alone in a decade period, that you would see apartments sell for $700,000 plus dollars. Yet it happens. Is property still a wise and safe investment? The old saying, it's as safe as houses, it's as safe as bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
Do we need to actually put that saying on hold for a while?
Well, we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful about our selection of property. Not all property is as safe as houses. So, the things that have changed over the last 20 years is that property investing has become far more complicated than it used to be. It used to be very simple. You'd go and buy a family home in a good location and up it'd go. But at the moment, there's so many distractions, I guess. There's so many options being offered to people. There's off-the-plan stuff. There's established property. There's positively geared property. But the reality is if you keep it simple, if you stick to the old rules, there's still some great investment properties to be had. 1300
222 774, or you can text 0437 774 774. Call 1300 222 774. They are harder to find. My sister-in-law said to me the other day, where can I find a bargain? And because I'm up feeding all the time, I'm searching property all the time. It's my... It's my porn, I call it, my house porn.
Okay.
I like to just look at houses. And I said, I don't think there's bargains anywhere.
There aren't really? No, there aren't really. Really what we're looking for in property is less the bargain, but more the property that's going to give the level of capital growth to our clients who are, looking to invest in property. So we're looking for properties that have got a history of capital growth and are in the sort of locations where we expect that to continue. One of the tips I give to people who are looking to buy property is to remember the old adage of location, location, location. But I'm asking people to separate what they think that really means from what I think it should mean. Rather than emphasise that it is the only thing to think about, I like people to think of that as it's a thing that should remind them to think about more than one thing other than location. In other words, location in the suburb of the street, location in the street, and if it's a flat, location in the block. So rather than just focus on the fact of, look, is it in a great suburb? It really comes down to a little more than that. So it's got to be in a great location in that suburb, etc. So think about more location aspects than just one location.
Has it changed in the sense that once, you were advised against buying on a busy road, along a train line, next to a block of flats, are these things now sort of falling to the wayside?
No, they're more important than ever, Richelle. The finite elements of selection are now very, very important. In fact, we look at about, I'd say 100 properties before we find 5 or 6 properties that we think are worthy of even investigation before recommendation to our clients. So, we really do knock them off. I guess we place ourselves, if you can think about it in these senses, if you were the real estate agent standing on the front door of a flat and saying, hi Richelle, your number, how did you go? Give you a call on Monday. Do you like it? Would you like to make an offer? No, we didn't like the fact that it was so close to the shops, or we didn't like the fact that the cars in the car parks were just a bit near the bedroom window. The agent knew that when he first saw the property, and he knew that would affect the outcome. So we look for all of those sort of things that are permanent compromises on the property, if you like. So we think people who are investing in property, if they can find something that really doesn't have any negative, then they really ought to go to the market and try and buy that property about for what it's worth, rather than try and see it as a potential bargain.
1300 222 774, or you can text 0437 774 774. I was having this discussion about, location and elements that would normally turn people off. One area that I thought may make people think, well, look, I will buy on a main road or along a train line or one of those things that would normally detract someone, because there's other elements that outweigh it. It's in the school zone that you want, for example, or it's in an area that you wouldn't otherwise be able to afford, and you have the lifestyle of being close to whatever it is that you may enjoy, say the bay or a particular park. And if it wasn't for that other element, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the fruits of that suburb.
Yeah, and you're talking from the point of view of buying a property to live in?
Yes. Okay,
well then that's a slightly different approach, because you do need to think about the other lifestyle aspects that surround that property. But for investing, we like to buy a property that doesn't have any compromise, so that when our client goes to offer that property for sale at 10, 15 or 20 years, there's no excuses.
Are people investing at the moment in houses or in apartments?
Or both. Both, absolutely. So there is some terrific buying in some houses in some of the inner north suburbs, particularly places like Pascoe Vale and Coburg. But the apartments have always, they haven't always, but at the moment they're showing that they will produce the good levels of capital growth in the suburbs that we like to think are the ones where people should invest, the inner east, the inner south, the inner north, places within reasonable reach of the CBD, and places with good lifestyle aspects to them.
In just a moment, I'll speak to you about apartments, but let's go to Michael in St Leonard, who has a question about housing ratio. Morning, Michael.
Good morning. In Melbourne, the average house is approximately 10 times average salary, and return on the investment properties that I've looked at have been about probably around 3%. So where do you see the future of that going? I can't see a good return for the next 5 years.
I know, yeah, if that.
Well, Michael, you're quite right. I mean, I think for houses it's very difficult to get more than 3%. For apartments, we used to say 4%, even as recently as this time last year. But we've seen properties being purchased by investors at around about 3.25% quite consistently. And the reason
how do you see growth? How do you see growth there? I can't see any growth in that if it's 10 times average salary.
Oh, you mean growth in the value of the property?
Yeah, because that's the only way you can get a return, because you know that if it grows in growth, you don't have to worry about your return.
Well, that's right. So capital growth ought to be the key. So, look, I think if you take a very conservative approach to it, we see capital growth for this year being, really quite small. Last year it was around about 8.5%, and we're predicting around about 6% for this year in residential property.
But it's become unaffordable.
I beg your pardon?
Does it become unaffordable when it gets that high, when the growth is that much?
Yeah, well, it is always unaffordable to some people, but property is affordable to a large number of people.
It's interesting to see. I mean, I know myself. Thanks so much for your call, Michael in St Leonard. 1300 222 774. I remember thinking, only probably 5 years ago, thinking, there's no way I'll see an apartment sell for $500,000 in whichever area. And, now that can.
Well, early in my career,
norm.
And, I'm probably a little bit older than I sound, Richelle, but early in my career, we used to see apartments selling in Armidale for $25,000. So, and all along my career, we've heard, people saying that, how far can it go? Can it get to 100? Can it get to 200,000? And we've always been shocked when those thresholds have been breached. But yes, it's an extraordinary story.
This is a good time to let you know that the information provided is general in nature and shouldn't be considered personal advice. Please seek independent advice before making any investment decisions. You don't have to look far now around the CBD and sort of within a 7K radius to see the huge growth in medium to high density apartments and the change in how these apartments are designed and the style of living that's designed as a result. So kitchens are almost done away with now. There's just a little weird tiny strip of a sink and a hot plate in your lounge room. Bathrooms are tiny little things. Bedrooms have almost become just sliding doors.
And Rochelle's car parks are disappearing.
Yeah, which is probably not necessarily a bad thing if it's promoting cycling and public transport.
Well, if it's promoting it there, that's fine. But whether or not people will see that as a viable option at the moment, things have to take a little bit of time to change. So investing in those properties, we see, a little bit pioneering. And, I absolutely agree that there will be a need for those properties. But, in a way, I guess that pioneering aspect is a little bit risky in my view.
Well, what I want to know is, how is it affecting, say, the older apartments, say the 1960s, 1970s apartments, which are generally quite large.
Great question.
Big hallways and entrance areas. They've generally got sort of dining space within the kitchen.
That's right.
And there's actually a separate kitchen.
And a table.
Yeah, God forbid some even have a laundry.
Yeah, that's right.
So are people investing in those older apartments, or are the younger renters now actually wanting the modern apartments that have the pools and the gyms and the no kitchens?
Well, okay, both those things apply. Look, really, as the smaller ones become more the norm, I think they'll actually make the older style apartments with the space in the very inner ring of Melbourne suburbs look even better. I think they'll maybe look even better options. People are concerned about how they'll affect the value. I don't think they'll affect their value in a negative sense at all into the future. The one thing we have seen, though, and we started to notice this halfway through last year, that it's becoming a little bit more difficult to get the rents for those properties we used to get because some of the new stuff is coming online. And while the new stuff is shiny, it's all shiny stainless steel and marble and lovely, if you could pay the same rent for that being a tower and maybe, then you would have to in a little low-rise in Melbourne or something, well, you might take the shiny option. But in the future for investing, though, for capital growth, we'll always go back to the smaller one. It's not about rent return. The rent returns will return to the older style properties as the newer ones become less new and less attractive.
That's interesting. 1300 222 774. You can text on 0437 774 774. Call 1300 222 774 if you have a question for Phil Manning, who is a property advisor from the WBP Property Group. New builds off the plan. I mean, is it a risk these days? We're seeing a lot of construction companies possibly going under, not as much money in those areas. Is it safe to, I'm not asking you to give specific advice to people, but do you think that buying off the plan will become more or less popular in the next 12 months?
Well, I hope it becomes a little bit less popular, Richelle, in fact, because, what we're seeing is people being very often very disappointed with the outcome after they've waited a couple of years. It's probably safe to say in a general sense, the overall promise of delivery isn't quite there. We're not certain about the values because when we buy or when a person buys for an investment property in the marketplace of an established property, they've got pieces of information available to them that you don't have with a new property, such as how has this property performed in the past? What's it actually done? What sort of rent return is it actually receiving? And because it's being bought in the marketplace in competition with other buyers, we're paying real market value. Whereas with an apartment block, very often the price paid is the cost of construction, a little bit of profit divided by the number of flats. In other words, the price is often set by the developer's accountant. And
if it takes a couple of years, what changes is going to happen in those couple of years? I mean, we've seen that in Carlton with a new freeway.
Changes to value, changes to superannuation and taxation laws. It's a little bit problematic in my view.
Jan's called in from Glen Iris. Good morning, Jan. What was your question for Phil?
Yeah. Good morning to you. Hi, good morning, Phil.
Hi, Jan.
We have an investment property in St. Kilda in Wellington Street, actually, and it has 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and 2 car parks. And we bought it about 7 years ago, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the investment value of the investment. How much do you think we will increase in our the money we invested in?
Well,
do you have any thoughts about this particular kind of property?
Well, Jan, sorry.
Yeah, the property is about 10 years old, and it has only 3 floors.
Okay, Jan, well, look.
2 bedroom, 2 bathrooms.
2 bedrooms, 2 baths.
Not too bad.
And Wellington Street's not too bad either, just off the St Kilda Junction there. And 2 car parks. So for those that don't know, Wellington Street runs through from Brighton Road, just near the St Kilda Junction, back to Chapel Street, just near the corner of Dandenong Road near Windsor there. So the location's really good. I think it's probably done okay. You've had it for a long enough now for it to see some capital growth. Obviously, I can't be too specific about it. It really depends. I mean, the one side of Wellington Street does have a little bit of a back-on issue to Dandenong Road, but in a general sense, the location is outstanding. So I'd expect that's done fairly well for you, Jan.
When you look at things like Jan's apartment that, say, is 2 bedrooms, 2 bathroom, 2 car parks, is that something that you would look for when you're investing, that you could have 2 people rent it? Yeah. So you'd have 2 individuals, 2 friends, whatever, 2 colleagues, as opposed to a couple that could live in a smaller apartment with only 1 bathroom. Of course, that would probably affect the price of the apartment. But is that something that's really quite important?
Yeah, look, what's really important in my view, as I mentioned earlier, is the car parking space situation. Whether it's a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom doesn't really matter that much, I don't think, so long as you pay the right price for it. Do you know, for a 1-bedroom flat, sometimes the rent return as a percentage of the purchase price can be slightly higher. So we'll see a block of flats in an area like St Kilda, where Jan mentioned earlier, where a 1-bedroom flat in the same block might rent for something like $350 a week, whereas a 2-bedder Whereas a 2-bedder in that same block will only rent for, say, $380 or $390. But the difference in sale price could be as much as $100,000. So, for that extra $100,000, you really only get that $40 or $50 a week extra rent. So, we when we look at these properties and assess them, we sometimes lower our eyes a little bit and actually say, well, maybe we don't need to spend quite as much. We'll get a really excellent rent return. And if the facilities are there and the potential to rent the property easily are there, well, then, those are the sort of properties we look at.
Would you see a 1-bedroom flat, though, rise in overall value?
Well, they have, Richelle.
Compared to, I know.
Historically, they have.
Who would have thought you would pay $400,000 for a studio apartment?
That's right, but things change. As I said to you, I've been in this industry a very long time. When I first started, you had to have a 2-bedroom flat to get them rented. A couple of girlfriends would rent together. Whereas now people are far more independent. If you do have a girl who wants to rent a flat in a 1-bedder, she'll be there by herself. She may be there with a partner. The reality is that 1-bedroom flats have become a little more popular as rent because there are less of them built when they were being built in the 70s. And people's lifestyles and approach to lifestyles are really, there's a little bit more of demand for that independence. So,
and if I'm going to generalise, you're probably going to have a very good tenant if you have a 1-bedroom.
Yeah, really good tenants. Actually, people get a little bit concerned about tenancies, but there's plenty of good tenants around.
I rented for a very long time. Yeah. I was fabulous.
We all did.
Yeah.
So was I.
1300 222 774, or you can text 0437 774 774. Lots of stories around with first home buyers versus investment buyers, and first home buyers being sort of pushed out of the market a little bit now. We've seen a loss or a reduction in the first home buyers grant,
that's right.
or various areas of the first home buyers grants depending. But we have seen a reduction in stamp duty, which I've found, that's where the big cost is. But mums and dads having to kick in, for those that are lucky enough, I guess, for mums and dads that can. Yeah. Is that just going to be something that is just, I've just had a baby and all of a sudden, my husband and I were saying...
Start saving, Richelle.
We have. You think that's funny.
No, I'm not.
Actually,
I think it's funny.
And we're not putting much away because, you can only put away what you can afford. But I thought, we're going to have to help this poor girl buy a house.
It's commonly referred to in the industry as the bank of mum and dad. And, and I think it's a I guess in a way if people are able to help their families before they die and leave the money to their families, well enough if they're in a position to do that. Very many people of my generation have found themselves fairly well established and perhaps are able to do that. So we see that quite often. We also see other different things with investing or even buying. We're seeing, say, 2 first home buyers, a couple of girls I've helped helped them buy properties where, 2 young women have bought a villa unit together, whereas, independently they couldn't have achieved that. So they buy those as tenants in common and get themselves into the property market.
1300 222 774 is the number to call if you do have a question for Phil. I know it's early in the year to be thinking finances and to be thinking property, but before you know it, the year is upon you and we have to start thinking like this. I had this discussion the other night and I find it quite interesting. I was kind of just throwing it out there and I don't know if this is the case, but I love to create a theory. My theory is that we're going to see all these kind of little sub-cities within our city occur. So the areas, I was talking in particular here, Bayside, sort of your Frankston, Edithvale, Aspendale area. So you're still Bayside, you're a fair way out of the CBD as such, but you're on a train line, you've got the bay, it's just stunning, and you've got your community sort of mini cities, being Frankston down there. Are we going to see a drive towards
We are,
The
Richelle.
city being split up.
That's right, because employment opportunities for people who live in those areas. Well, there are, there's industries and social infrastructures in those areas. If you lived in Frankston, you might work in Dandenong. You might drop back into the Cranbourne corridor. So, and the same thing applies in the north. Where there's, or even in the west, where there's massive developments going ahead. So, we expect to see, as a result of some of these massive growths in the growth corridors out into the west, the increase in infrastructures in the inner west and the inner north, where medical and business infrastructures will start to show, and employment opportunities will, I guess, meet those developments halfway between the traditional locations of employment now and where they are.
And I guess it's affordable to still get into some of those
Absolutely
areas.
affordable for first-home buyers. First-home buyers, I know they hate the idea, but they really do have to look a little bit further away from the city.
Well, it's not new to do that,
no,
really, is
we've
it?
all done it.
Mark's in Rosebud. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
What's
Hi,
your
Mark.
question?
I'm just wondering about the ripple effect, how it works from generally from capital city. Let's say from Melbourne to the Mornington Peninsula. How long do you reckon it takes for things to gradually filter through?
Yeah, good
Yeah,
question.
no, that's a really good question, Mark.
It is.
Outer areas.
It is a really good. That's a really good question, and just if you don't mind, I could take a minute to just perhaps explain to yourself and other listeners the ripple effect. And I like to talk about it in terms of Melbourne or the property market as being like a bit of a dam or a pond, and then an event will occur like a lowering of interest rates and a shortage of stock, and in the middle of the city, the prices will start to rise. So we go into this period of capital growth, and so it's like someone threw a rock into the middle of the lake, and the ripples start to work their way out. And it also explains why properties in the middle of Melbourne actually grow at a greater rate than the outer areas. Now, the ripples will move their way right out to the end of the dam and pick up places as they go. They'll cross Dandenong Road, then they'll cross Springvale Road, then they'll get down to Frankston, or they'll get out in the east and out in the north as time passes. And then there'll be an event that stops that ripple, that period of capital growth, like typically the third or fourth interest rate rise in a series. But capital growth finishes at the same time across the whole lake. But it's the areas in the middle of the lake, in other words, in the middle of Melbourne, that lived in that period of capital growth for a longer period of time, and therefore they got more of an advantage for that period of capital growth. And that's why areas like Frankston, Rosebud, or the outer eastern areas like Ringwood or way up north, northern suburbs of Melbourne, that's why the capital growth rate, generally speaking, is lower than the inner suburbs. So how long it takes to get out there really depends on the strength of the ripple. So, like in 2007, 2008, we had an incredibly strong capital growth ripple run through the inner suburbs of Melbourne, and it took 6 or 8 months to reach the outer suburbs.
That's not very long, though, is it?
It's not very long. That's really fast. At the moment, it's probably going to take, I think some of the capital growth effects we had in the inner suburbs of Melbourne last year will be reaching the outer suburbs, perhaps in the first half of this year.
That was very extensive. I'm sure that answered your question, Mark, from Rosebud, didn't it?
It did, actually. And can I just make a comment too? We bought a property and we were a bit silly. We paid a bit too much for it, and consequently now it's worth about 100,000, 150,000 maybe less than what we paid for it about 4 years ago.
Okay. Well, look, don't beat yourself up and don't say we paid too much. Just say you bought it too early.
I like that. That sounds better.
Too early.
Yeah.
We should have got a valuation.
You'll be right.
Yeah.
Stick with it.
Oh, thank you for that.
Good on you, Mark. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
Mark.
weekend. He's in the right spot down there in Rosebud. That's you're seeing lots of people even commute from those areas now, and commuting change. We don't have longer. So just quickly, I want to ask you about international buyers and how they're changing the landscape, particularly in areas that are in good school zones and in the CBD for students.
Look, the international buyers are a really big part of the Melbourne marketplace now. Now, we've got to be a little bit careful and understand what really an international buyer is. A buyer who has no residency status in Australia at all, in other words, they live overseas permanently, cannot buy established residential real estate in Australia. They can only buy off the plan new property. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing in these areas that you've mentioned, Richelle, like the school zones, is being purchased by overseas people, but who have residencies in Australia. Now they are, like for example, in the Balwyn High School zone, I actually haven't done a close analysis of it, but land values in that area there, to me, appear to be more expensive than places like, say, Brighton even.
Yeah, well, and it's something that's going to school zones is always driven and is going to for a long time. Well, it's going to be an interesting year ahead. Finance is always tricky, but it's going to be an interesting year ahead. Phil Manning, property advisor at WPB Property Group. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Richelle.
No worries. Have a wonderful weekend.
Same to you.